All right, Ice and Fire trivia, everyone. Ice and Fire trivia. What were the last two houses to marry into House Targaryen before House Targaryen started popping out princes and princesses that were promised? You have 5 seconds. All right, time's up. If you answered House Dayne, they're on the thumbnail, so you better have gotten that one. And House Blackwood, give yourself a pat on the back, because yes, House Dayne and House Blackwood were the last two Westerosi houses to marry into the royal bloodline of House Targaryen before 2 generations of brother-sister incest preserved approximately the same admixture all the way down to Rhaegar and Dany. You know, House Dayne and House Blackwood, only the 2 most magical, cool, and mysterious houses in all of Westeros besides House Stark and Targaryen. And what's weird is I really just don't hear a lot of people talking about that. I mean, do we really think that's meaningless and not something that we should be considering strongly when we think about the magical potential for Daenerys and her endgame? Obviously, there's a lot of talk about Jon Snow and his many magical bloodlines, but what about the fact that Daenerys has as much Blackwood ancestry in her pie chart / quartered shield as Bloodraven, whose Blackwood blood makes him a Greenseer? And what about the fact that the Daynes safeguard a magic sword that is probably Lightbringer and may descend from the OG Dragon Lords from Asshai? Is it really a coincidence that George gives House Targaryen an infusion of Dayne ancestry right before it manages to hatch dragons for the first time in over 150 years? That's right, I've said all I can say about A Night of the Seven Kingdoms last Saturday on the live stream. And so here I am back to my old tricks with a fresh theory about Daenerys, a couple of theories actually in this video, and this will be spoilers all books. But there is a Night of the Seven Kingdoms tie-in because it's Maekar's marriage to Diana Dayne, which is the source of this Dayne ancestry in House Targaryen that we're going to discuss today. Egg is fully half Dayne, in other words, and he goes on to marry Black Betha Blackwood. Then 2 of their kids incest marry Jaehaerys and Shera, and then their kids are Aerys and Rhaella, who also incest marry. And then we get Rhaegar and Dany. Anyway, I hope this idea has grabbed your attention because I'm actually about to do a series of videos which will hopefully change the way you see Daenerys forever and what her endgame could be. I've had these theories brewing for a while now, so in this video, I'm going to try to answer the question of why she is 1/4 Dayne, speaking in very overgeneralized genetic terminology, of course. And then after that, I'll have a video about the purpose of Dany being half Blackwood, so to speak. And then after that, I'll have a video about the Jon and Dany Knights King and Queen ending, which I do think is possible, and which is probably the only way we're going to get a Jon and Dany together type ending. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of those videos. And by the way, in this video, we're also going to get into speculating about what Rhaegar and Arthur Dayne's bestie relationship was like. And specifically, we're going to talk about what plans they may have laid for the future, who they might have expected to wield Dawn, and to fulfill the prophecies. So get ready and click that thumbs up button while the intro music plays, and let's do this. All right, so in brief, I am here to propose that the reason for the recent Dayne ancestry in House Targaryen is the Great Empire of the Dawn. And I mean this in terms of why Maekar himself married Diana Dayne, and also why George structured the story so that the Targaryens have this recent infusion of Dayne blood. Said another way, some of the Daynes manifest Valyrian features, such as silver hair or purple eyes, because according to my original Great Empire of the Dawn theory from all the way back in 2015, and as always, shout out Durin Durndon, who gave me a big piece of this, the Daynes share a common ancestor with the Valyrians, with that common ancestor being the OG Dragon Lords from Asshai, who are, according to theory, one and the same as the Great Empire of the Dawn that we hear about in the world of Ice and Fire. The occasional Valyrian features potentially make the Daynes attractive marriage partners for House Targaryen. That's what I mean about Maekar marrying Diana Dayne. Not that Maekar was hip to the Great Empire of the Dawn or any of that, just that he might have married Diana Dayne because she looked kind of Valyrian, potentially like Darkstar. Because as we know, the Targaryens are always trying very hard to preserve or even enhance their Valyrian features. And speaking in magical terms, this infusion of potential original Dragonlord blood into House Targaryen may have contributed to Dany's ability to miraculously hatch the dragons. There's more we're going to talk about, such as the purpose of Dawn and who will wield Dawn and all that, but that's the gist of where we're going. And by the way, if you've heard some other YouTuber tell you that it's very, very silly to think that the Great Empire of the Dawn is somehow going to be relevant to the story at all because it only appears in the World of Ice and Fire, which is just a world book, well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened to you. And also, it's just plain old a misunderstanding of what people mean when they talk about the Great Empire of the Dawn. The theory actually starts in Dany's 3rd chapter of A Game of Thrones, and with the idea that she is correct when she says, "She had heard that the first dragons had come from the east, from the Shadowlands beyond Ashai and the islands of the Jade Sea. Perhaps some were still living there, in realms strange and wild." So that's where it begins, with the idea that what Dany has heard is correct. The dragons first did come from Ashai and the Shadowlands. And as most of you will know, there are many more clues along these lines linking Ashai and dragons scattered all throughout the series. And the official Great Empire of the Dawn theory is simply that George has always imagined that dragons first came from Ashai, and then later garnered in the name Great Empire of the Dawn when he was fleshing out all the history of the further east in the World of Ice and Fire. So it's not the name that's important, but rather the idea that the Valyrians and Danes both descend from a common dragon lord ancestor in ancient Ashai, and that is why the Danes occasionally manifest Valyrian looks and carry around a sword which is similar to Valyrian steel but different, and which is probably Lightbringer, and also why the Danes say they came to Westeros from somewhere else in the Dawn Age. And yes, I'm going to wave this around for the entire rest of the video. No, I won't do that. I'll put it on my lap like a king of winter. And most crucially, the narrative point of George choosing to flesh out the ancient dragon lords from Ashai idea in the World of Ice and Fire, which he definitely did, is to explain to we the reader how and why ancient prophecies from Ashai about Azor Ahai and Lightbringer are relevant to Westeros and to our main characters. It's the answer to why both Jon and Dany are being counseled by Shadowbinders from Ashai, Jon by Melisandre and Dany by Quaithe. And it's the answer to why the Danes have a magic sword, which is probably Lightbringer, and the answer to why they've been showing up with Valyrian features since the first book. And actually, none other than Elio Garcia himself once speculated that the Danes and Valyrians may have a common ancestor after A Feast for Crows came out. So before Dance with Dragons and long before the World of Ice and Fire was even a glimmer in George's eye. And he speculated that because there's a lot of evidence for it in the main series. Ergo, I think it is inarguable that knowledge from Ashai, people from Ashai, prophecies from Ashai, artifacts from Ashai are all quite relevant to the main story, and I'll thank everyone to stop dismissing Great Empire of the Dawn theory based on the misunderstanding that it all comes from the World Book, which, as you can see, it does not. So we don't have time to recap the whole theory any more than we did already, but I laid it out most elegantly and most recently in the videos What Happened to Ashai and also Origins of Old Town. And then I focused on the last hero, Lightbringer, House Dayne connections in the videos Dawn equals Lightbringer and Who Was the Last Hero. For now, I will go ahead and assume that you at least have some working understanding of this theory, because those videos are pretty much always the most popular on my channel. And if you're watching this one, you've probably seen one of those. What we really want to discuss today are the ramifications of House Dayne having descended from the Great Empire of the Dawn in the context of House Targaryen. So let's go on to the next section and have a look at that tangled Targaryen family tree. Oh, what a tangled web several Aegons have woven. And so, yes, let's take a look at the Targaryen family tree, twisted and twining as it is. And this one is illustrated by artist Polly M, shout out. So as you can see, there is this Martell infusion with King Daeron II marrying Mariah Martell, which is why Baelor Breakspear comes out looking Dornish, as they say, quote unquote, with dark brown hair and eyes, and also why Baelor's son Valar has medium brown hair with a little silver streak and eyes which are blue. And of course, the Targaryens do kind of have eyes on a spectrum from purple to indigo to blue. As we know, there is a random element to which traits you take from your mother or your father, and Baelor Breakspear's brother Maekar, despite having the same Martell mother, came out with the traditional Valyrian look, silver hair, purple eyes. Maekar then marries Diana Dayne and has 6 children. And if Diana Dayne had had darker looks, well, then you'd expect most of Maekar and Diana's kids to come out with dark hair and maybe even dark eyes, since Maekar is still carrying those Martell genetics, even if he is not expressing them in the hair and eye color. That doesn't really seem to be the case, though. Of those 6 kids, we get physical descriptions for 3 of them, and Aerion and Egg both have prototypical Valyrian looks, silver hair, purple eyes, while Daeron the Drunkard has sandy brown hair and a blonde beard. To me, that suggests that Diana Dayne was probably one of the Valyrian-looking Danes, again, kind of like Darkstar, and that she actually steered the Targaryen bloodline back in the direction of classic Valyrian looks. And just in case you're wondering, and in case you haven't heard this before, George has clarified in an interview question that House Dayne does not have Targaryen blood, and that is not the explanation for their purple eyes and silver hair. And that's where we get the theory that they have some ancient common ancestor with the Valyrians. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Diana Dayne having silver eyes and or purple hair would also explain why House Targaryen chose Diana Dayne to marry into the family in the first place. We know that House Targaryen was interested in making marriage alliances with Dorne at that time because this is the time period when they're integrating Dorne into the Seven Kingdoms. And it's interesting that after taking care of House Martell with the Daeron Mariah Martell marriage, the next Dornish house they chose was House Dayne. It's not the second most important house in Dorne, but they do have those occasional Valyrian features. So you kind of see what I'm getting at here. If Diana looked Valyrian, then that may be why she was chosen. And so, if the Danes are in fact descended from the first Dragon Lords in Asshai, then Maekar's marriage to Diana Dayne would have increased the amount of Dragonlord genetics in the Targaryen bloodline, and without making them more inbred, which maybe that's important. So yes, this absolutely could be a part of the reason why Daenerys is able to hatch the dragon's eggs after so many generations of Targaryens could not. There's really no way to prove why it worked for Dany. I mean, I do think the Red Comet was a big factor, and obviously you got to do some blood sacrifice. But it is also logical to hypothesize that an infusion of Dane blood helped bring the dragon mojo out of retirement, so to speak. To use a California horticultural parallel, this would be kind of like back-crossing OG Kush into one of the many strains, such as biscotti or gelato, which is derived from original form-cut Girl Scout cookies, which was itself a 3-way combination of OG Kush, cherry pie, and Durban poison. You do that to bring out more of that original OG funk and potency. And so too with Diana Dayne. That's OG Dragonlord genetics, and it may have brought back the funk. And you're welcome. That's the kind of ice and fire coverage that you only find here, for better or for worse. Now, consider this. Rhaegar, who is also a quarter Dane like his sister Daenerys, may have understood all of this. So now let me ask you this. Was it really just chance that Rhaegar's best friend, and really his only close friend, was Sir Arthur Dayne, a Sword of the Morning who carried Dawn? Rhaegar, so far as we know, seems like he was obsessed with fulfilling the prophecy of Azor High Reborn / the prince that was promised, which do appear to be the same prophecy. And he just happens to pal around with the guy who probably possesses Lightbringer and whose house, theoretically, descends from the OG Dragonlords from Asshai. This was the one guy, sorry John Connington, whom Rhaegar totally opened up to. Now, I'm not saying Rhaegar was only friends with Arthur because of the sword. I mean, that's really shallow. But the bottom line is that if House Dayne does carry any sort of secret knowledge about Azor High and the original Long Night, then Arthur Dayne would probably know about it, since he was named Sword of the Morning and entrusted with carrying Dawn, which is probably Lightbringer. And given that Rhaegar and Arthur were such besties, it just seems like they really would have talked about all this. This is the stuff Rhaegar cares about, and Arthur Dayne does seem to be completely on board and behind everything that Rhaegar does. He was with Rhaegar when he absconded with Lyanna Stark. He was with Rhaegar and Lyanna when they visited the Isle of Faces. I suppose we don't know if he crossed the water with them and went to the actual Isle, but they were all together during this time. And of course, Arthur Dayne was left to guard Lyanna and baby Jon at the Tower of Joy. And for what it's worth, Ashara Dayne also seems to have been part of Rhaegar's inner circle. On top of all of that, and I just want to emphasize this again, Rhaegar and Arthur Dayne are distantly related, and Rhaegar, technically, he is a member of House Dayne. He has a traceable recent Dane ancestry, and therefore there's really no reason why Arthur should have hesitated in sharing any of the House Dayne's secrets with Rhaegar. You know, secrets like what are the Dayne house words? What is the criteria for being named Sword of the Morning? Is Dawn in fact Lightbringer, and do they know that? Do the Daynes know that they are from the Great Empire of the Dawn, or we might say, do they still know it? And also, did they choose the purple and white colors of their sigil to match the purple eyes and platinum metallic silver hair of the Dragon Lords? Yeah, you ever think about that? So, not only might the Dayne bloodline be important, Rhaegar might have known that and have been thinking about that. Rhaegar obviously knew that he was 1/4 Dayne, and if Arthur knew about House Dayne's connections to Ashai and the OG Dragon Lords, and if Arthur shared that information with Rhaegar, well, that may have contributed to Rhaegar's belief that his children would be able to fulfill the prophecy and wake dragons from stone. Instead, Rhaegar's sister did that, but, his son Jon will probably ride a dragon. Along the same lines, if Rhaegar and Arthur are looking at Dawn as Lightbringer, and if Arthur shared Rhaegar's view that Rhaegar's children would be fulfillments of this ancient prophecy, then Rhaegar and Arthur probably would have been expecting that one of Rhaegar's children would have grown up to wield Dawn. Perhaps they thought it would be baby Aegon, perhaps they thought it would be Jon Snow, and either way, this is something that Arthur and Rhaegar would have discussed and planned for. So let's talk about that. So yes, the other huge potential purpose for George Martin putting this recent Dayne marriage into the family tree of House Targaryen is the Sword of the Morning, Dawn itself, meaning who has the right to wield Dawn. As I just mentioned, the most logical candidate to wield Dawn, assuming that it is Lightbringer, would be one of the 3 heads of the prince that was promised Azor High Reborn dragon. And so I have always wondered if Dawn would find its way into the hands of Jon or Daenerys. Now, Rhaegar's kids, Aegon, Rhaenys, and Jon, would only be 1/8 Dayne at that point. Again, speaking very crudely, and the geneticists are just dying listening to this. But it's a fantasy story, just work with me here. They've got some recent Dayne blood, and the point is, if Rhaegar and Arthur were thinking that the prophecies would be fulfilled in Rhaegar's children, they may have been planning for one of them to inherit Dawn. This plan could still be known to House Dayne, and therefore could be relevant to the end of the story. That's right, it's kind of like Robb's will. It's a plan made by dead people that could still be enacted by people who are alive. And both of these plans actually are pointing back to Jon in all likelihood. So there is a lot of foreshadowing that Jon Snow will be the one to wield Dawn against the others. But I pretty much rinsed those arguments out as thoroughly as I could in the Dawn equals Lightbringer and Who Was the Last Hero videos. So I don't want to rehash that here, and I also don't want to get a bunch of Jon Snow all over our Daenerys video. It is pretty compelling evidence, though, in my opinion. I'm not 100% sold on Jon wielding Dawn, but I do think it is very possible and even likely. So check out those videos if you haven't already, and if you're interested in the idea of Jon wielding Dawn. Now, I will briefly bring up the Edric Dayne Darkstar 5-year gap thing, in case anyone hasn't heard or in case you've forgotten about that, because that's definitely relevant here. And it goes a little something like this. So originally George planned to have a 5-year time skip between A Storm of Swords and A Feast for Crows. And by the way, this is back when the material that became Feast and Dance were still one book in George's mind. So there was going to be a 5-year time jump after Storm, but George ended up writing a few chapters in that continuum and then scrapping it because he decided that it didn't work. So originally, young and noble Edric Dayne, who's 13 or so at the time of Storm, would have been 18 after the 5-year time jump and therefore would have been potentially qualified to wield Dawn. He's certainly of noble character. He's fought with Beric and the Brotherhood defending the common people, and now he's 18. So yeah, maybe he was going to be named Sword of the Morning. And by the way, George has clarified in an interview that the sword Dawn is in Starfall, quote, waiting for a new Sword of the Morning to rise, which sounds like, that's probably going to happen in some form before the story is over. But then the 5-year time jump was scrapped, and so Edric is stuck at 13, and he's just not old enough. So then we get A Feast for Crows, and suddenly here is Gerald Dayne, aka Darkstar. He looks like a freaking Dragon Lord, says Ariane, and oh yeah, he's obsessed with the sword Dawn. Now, Darkstar is not, very distinctly not, the sort of honorable man who would be named Sword of the Morning, but he is the sort of man who might steal it. And indeed, I made a video called Darkstar Will Steal Dawn to explain all the foreshadowing that I think points towards that, and towards Darkstar joining the Kingsguard of Fagon in King's Landing. So a cheap knockoff imposter Sword of the Morning for a fake, an imposter, a mummer's dragon version of Rhaegar's son. And of course, they would be trying to mimic the famous relationship between Arthur Dayne and Rhaegar here. So this is kind of a political coup for Fagon to have the quote-unquote Sword of the Morning join his Kingsguard, just as Arthur Dayne served his father. In other words, the narrative purpose of Edric Dayne, which was then transferred over to Darkstar after the 5-year gap was scrapped, was simply to get Dawn out of Starfall and then probably die so that other people can use it. And the reason why either noble Edric Dayne or the dastardly Darkstar can serve this purpose is precisely because neither one of them was ever intended to be the final wielder of Dawn against the White Walkers. They just aren't important enough characters. However, if Darkstar does steal Dawn and then join Fagon's Kingsguard, Dawn will be in King's Landing when Dany gets there and tries to take it from Fagon. And Darkstar is surely in need of killing, no matter what the outcome of that battle in King's Landing is. That would potentially put Lightbringer into the hands of Daenerys, who is obviously one manifestation of Azor High Reborn / the Prince that was promised. And now we're getting somewhere. So, if Dawn needs to be literally used in combat versus the White Walkers, then perhaps the plan is for Dany to give it to Jon to use. I know Jon has Longclaw already, but I really think he's going to give that back to Jorah and House Mormont. If you recall, Old Bear Mormont's dying wish, expressed to Sam Tarly, is that his son Jorah try to redeem his disgraced honor by taking the Black and joining the Night's Watch. And by the time Jorah could possibly do that, it'll be time to fight the White Walkers. It would make good logistical sense to spread the other killing swords around as much as possible. And so yeah, if Jon has Dawn to use, then it kind of makes sense that he might give Jorah back Longclaw. And as it happens, this would actually fulfill a promise that Dany made to Jorah all the way back in A Game of Thrones. One day you shall have from my hands a longsword like none the world has ever seen, dragon-forged and made of Valyrian steel. So I know a lot has happened between Dany and Jorah since this moment, and this would definitely be more than Jorah deserves to have any kind of redemption arc. But, you know, the only people that can really have a redemption arc are people who have disgraced themselves. And I think it's easy to see the poetic sense that it would make if this promise is fulfilled by Dany giving Jon Dawn so that Jon gives Jorah Longclaw. And if you hate Jorah, just think about the old bear and how happy he would be to see the family sword in his son's hands, serving the highest purpose possible, fighting the White Walkers. And of course, we did see a plot beat like this on the show, so maybe that's something that they got from George. And so yes, if Dawn is meant to be wielded against the others by a new Sword of the Morning, it really only makes sense for it to be Jon, who will be leading the Night's Watch and the forces of the living against the others, just like the first last hero did. However, I do think that Dany will possess Dawn first in King's Landing. And another interesting line that may foreshadow Dany acquiring Dawn is her saying to Hisdar in A Dance with Dragons, "In my 7 kingdoms, knights go on quests to prove themselves worthy of the maiden that they love. They seek for magic swords, for chests of gold, for crowns stolen from a dragon's hoard." So then after they work out a marriage pact based on Hisdar stopping the murders committed by the Harpy's sons and not questing for magical artifacts, Dany jokingly says that, "I may still want a magic sword." Meanwhile, we have Jon halfway around the world at the wall thinking, he might as well wish for another 1,000 men, and maybe a dragon or 3. And also, a sword that makes its own heat would be a fine thing on the wall. In other words, and I hope I'm not breaking any news here, Jon and Dany will be using magic swords and dragons to fight the others at the wall. And the most logical and plausible path that I can think of for Dawn to, make its way up north and be a part of that is for Darkstar to steal it, bring it to King's Landing, die, cough it up, to Dany, who will then bring it to the wall, and like I said, potentially give it to Jon. However, I do suspect that Dawn may have a magical purpose beyond just swinging it at people like a giant meat cleaver, and if this is the case, it could be Daenerys herself who unlocks its power. When I say that Dawn could have a magical purpose other than chopping people, I'm definitely thinking about other magical swords from other fantasy stories which have some sort of purpose other than, again, chopping people into pieces of meat. The Sword of Shannara, for example, reveals hidden truths to people by immersing them in all-encompassing visions. The elven blades in Lord of the Rings warn of the presence of orcs, which is very handy, and many fantasy swords do some version of trapping people's spirits or souls inside of them, and probably Stormbringer, Elric's Stormbringer, is the most famous example of this. Lightbringer itself, in fact, is said to drink people's souls. The legend of its forging says of Nissa Nissa that her blood and her soul and her strength and her courage all went into the steel. Martin's glass candles are also worth considering here because glass candles are made out of obsidian, and obsidian kills the others. And really the glass candles are just like 3-foot dragon glass longswords stuck into candle holders. They serve many purposes, as we know, such as enabling astral projection, remote viewing, dream implantation, and maybe more than that. As we've learned in the last couple years, there is a scrapped draft for the A Feast for Crows prologue, back from before the 5-year gap in fact, where Martin is exploring the idea that a sorcerer can actually bind their life essence to a glass candle, and that the sorcerer will essentially be unkillable as long as the candle is burning. So basically a Horcrux or a soul jar, pretty classic fantasy stuff. And so here is what I think. I think that Dawn, which is repeatedly described as being as pale as milk glass, does have the magical properties of a glass candle. And I'm not saying it's made out of like white dragon glass or something like that. I do think it is Comet Steel, as advertised. Shout out to King Tut's meteor sword. However, I think the wordplay is meant to suggest that Dawn has a glass candle-like function, a milk glass candle, if you wish. And if that's the case, then the qualifications for Dawn aren't being big and strong enough to wield it or just being a good swordsman, but rather having a proficiency with glass candles. Now, as of the end of A Feast for Crows, Marwyn the Mage was taking ship to get to Slaver's Bay as fast as he could to help Daenerys save the world, just in case those tricksy prophecies turn out to be true. As I always love to point out, Marwyn the Mage is the Archmaester of the Higher Mysteries with a Valyrian steel rod, ring, and mask, and as such he is the custodian of the Citadel's magical artifacts such as the glass candles, at least 4 that they possess. Now, do this thought experiment with me. If you are Marwyn the Mage, and you have access to all these glass candles and you know how to use them already, you would obviously take one when you're traveling halfway around the world to help bring Dany back to Westeros to save the world. Marwyn the Mage has already been using his glass candle in Old Town to stay up on everything that's happening at the Wall. So obviously if he's traveling all the way to Slaver's Bay, he's going to want to continue to keep an eye on things at the Wall and everywhere else. And thus I find it basically impossible to imagine Marwyn going to Slaver's Bay without bringing a glass candle. Obviously in some sort of very fancy travel case. Ergo, Daenerys will soon have her hands on a glass candle in Slaver's Bay, and I believe that she will almost immediately begin using it under Marwyn's tutelage. And while we're talking about it, let's give another artist shout out to VHDArt and this incredible Dany glass candle art that I was very happy to use for the thumbnail of this video. Big shout out. And she also did this one that I used on the most magical characters video. Anyway, yeah, Dany's gonna be using the glass candle. It'll come in handy, you know, for military reasons as she potentially tries to take Volantis and then retake Westeros, and I've long speculated that she may use the glass candle to have better communication with Quaithe, and maybe get to the bottom of the truth, the ancient truth that's in Ashai that Quaithe is always hyping up to Dany. Dany may even use the glass candle to get in contact with the Gemstone Emperors again and learn more stuff about Azor Ahai and the Long Night, which will help steer her course in the future. Perhaps she'll catch a glimpse of Jon Snow at the Wall. The main thing is that by the time Daenerys gets to King's Landing, she will already have experience using the glass candles and will therefore be in a position to unlock any hidden glass candle-like properties that Dawn may possess. And if having Dayne blood is important to unlocking the potential Dawn magic, well, she's got that too. So perhaps Dawn enables, you know, magical glass candle sight to some sort of different place, like maybe the Heart of Winter. Or perhaps there is ancient knowledge encoded within Dawn that Dany will need to solve the puzzle of the White Walkers and the Long Night. After all, what is it that the gemstone-eyed kingly ghost emperors are holding in their hands in Dany's vision? Swords of pale fire. And obviously these could be the same type of swords as Dawn. A pale sword, which, if it's Lightbringer, will catch on fire, perhaps with pale flame. These Lightbringer swords in the hands of the Gemstone Emperors would seem to imply that Dawn is from the great empire of the Dawn. But it may go further. Perhaps the emperors were using the glass candle powers of their Dawn swords to communicate through time and space with Daenerys, or perhaps to preserve some remnant of their spirits which are now able to communicate with Daenerys. In other words, Martin may still be planning to use this whole spirits tied to glass candles thing from the scrapped A Feast for Crow draft. And perhaps Dany will use Dawn to get in contact with these proto-Valyrian ancestor spirits from Ashai who may be locked within Dawn itself. After all, and I know I just said after all, but after all, if Nissa's soul went into Lightbringer, then Dawn may already have souls in it. And by the way, I have an equally old 2015 theory that I still believe in, that Nissa and the Amethyst Empress are one and the same person. Bloodstone Emperor murdered Amethyst Empress, and that caused the Long Night, and Azor Ahai murdered Nissa supposedly during the Long Night, but it cracked the moon, which is a good way to cause a long night. So yeah, those might be the same story. And although we don't have time to go into that now, I will actually be doing a Nissa Explained video after these 3 Dany videos, so hang on. And just for today's purposes, entertain the thought for a second. If Nissa was the Amethyst Empress, that would put at least one Gemstone Emperor inside of Dawn. And the Amethyst Empress, with her purple eyes, is of course the best candidate of all the Gemstone Emperors to belong to the clan that was the ancient common ancestor of the Valyrians and the Danes. So at the end of the day, Lightbringer is called Lightbringer because it is somehow the key to ending the Long Night. If the key to ending the Long Night is just chopping and melting the others with Dawn, then Dawn doesn't need to do anything other than just catch on fire and have someone to wield it. However, if the problem of dealing with the Long Night and the others is more complex, if it's more than just chopping them down, which most people expect it to be given Martin's themes of reconciliation and the senselessness of war, then wouldn't it make sense if Lightbringer brings the light of knowledge and understanding somehow, the understanding that Jon and Dany need to help solve the core problem of these long nights and the messed up seasons and the others and all the rest. So there you go, folks. Do let me know in the comments what you think of this new Dany theory, and watch out for even more cracked Dany magical, and hopefully not cracked, but more Dany endgame theories in the Why is Dany Half Blackwood video and Knights King and Queen. I don't know what I'll call that, but it'll have a picture of Jon and Dany as Knights King and Queen on the cover. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Lots of good stuff coming. And of course, I'll be live after every Night of the Seven Kingdoms episode. I think there's 2 more left. But yeah, I'll be going live with Grey Waste Tim and Estella Graves after each episode. So I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Cheers.